Thank you. Good evening. So I will do a short introduction to Elliott. As we have already heard, I had the pleasure to tour a lot with Elliott. We played in New York and in Italy and in Berlin and in Austria in very different combinations. We played pieces of him with our group, and we toured a lot together. But what he probably doesn't know is the first concert I saw of him was in 1990 in New York. When I was pretty young, I was 26. I went to New York and I went to the knitting factory that was based close to Lower East Side. It was at 2 o'clock in the morning or 2:30 in the morning. I was a young, serious composer, and improvising a little bit, but a young, serious composer. I went to this place, which was almost broken. It was a little bit dangerous. You had to go through a hole in the wall to get to the concert place, and there was a guy without hair who played a bass clarinet, amplified, and so loud that we had to put our hands on the ears. And there was smoke all over the place. That was the time where you could still smoke in US and also in Europe for sure. You could drink and smoke and listen to this music, and it was really like a wind coming into your face and standing and listen. It was a huge physical impression and a sound-wise impression. And for sure, when I later on founded my group Zeitkratzer, which is a composer-performing group, the first thing I did was inviting Elliott Sharp. Why? He did things also in this concert already, which I thought were completely forbidden in Germany contemporary music. The first thing, improvising was not allowed. It was called aleatoric music. It was like there's a huge discussion now going on about John Cage, for example, who George Lewis brought up, who's now teaching at Columbia University. That John Cage was a specialist in chess music. He did radio shows on chess music. His first piece, Fontana Mix, was only using chess music, but he never credited chess music in order to find his chance operations. He never wanted to have this connection. He always wanted to have this distinguished classical thing, more or less. So I even did an interview with George Lewis, who told me that Merce Cunningham was sorry about it. He said, I knew it because the first thing Merce Cunningham did was playing with a very famous drummer in the 50s. So this was forbidden to improvise. The next thing that was really forbidden was to play amplified and to play loud. Because it was rock and roll or something like this. It was not contemporary music. It was not. The thing was to hide. If you use speakers in electronic music, you hide the speakers. That was the philosophy in Ilkam in France. But that was really like, here we are, we show it, we do it. And anyway, we write string quartets, or we write orchestra pieces, we do it, we know to write. So this distinguished culture was not there in this downtown situation in New York at that time. So I actually invited him, and what he did, he came over, he wrote a piece for us, which was rhythmical for sure. So we had to work on it because we were not used to do this. It was amplified. It was a kind of ideology at that time that we wanted to be amplified in order to have microscopic sounds, in order to use other sounds, and not in order to be loud, but in order to have access to other sounds and use them like little sounds like this. We toured this piece a lot. Other groups played it, and I think Elliott did a lot of other pieces also afterwards for ensembles, for orchestra pieces. It came up. He wrote for Ensemble Modern. He wrote for orchestras like the Hessische Rundfunk-Symphonieorchester and things like this. And it also had improvisations. He called it pop-outs, so we could improvise. Yeah. The piece had the title Coriolis Effects. That's something that we already had in the dinner with Mandelbrot and what's the English name of the green vegetable we had? Romanesco. That means it's a reference to fractal geometry. It's a reference to dynamic systems, we would say. So we also had this in common because Elliott was very into physics. I studied mathematics first before I became a musician. And he actually got a scholarships in 1968 for physics from the National Science Foundation, and went to the university in Pittsburgh, where where he could stay for some time, but where he discovered also a tape machine. That was, I think, the more interesting thing in the free time. You discovered the 7-track tape machine, you told me, and he checked out the delays and everything. So he also has this physical background and this background to electronic music, which is a physical background. And also they had a good music library, but a good record music library. So he made a radio show, like, I think this was a good old time where you had radio shows like till 5 o'clock in the morning, and you could play really different stuff, like really discovering everything from free jazz to Stockhausen to film music, every different things. To Xenakis. And for sure, electronic music. But electronic music in a very broad sense. It's not the electronic music, what we call electronic music usually in contemporary music in Europe. It's electronic music in the sense of Jimi Hendrix, Star Spangled Banner, the studio version. I would love to play it here in the American Academy, but we don't hear it now. But if you have a possibility to listen to this, do it. It's really electronic music. It's overdubbed. It's with the guitar. It's feedback. It's very, very beautiful piece. But this in connection to Varese, who came from France to the United States, who made electronic music, who worked for the deliberation of noise, as you call it in English, Geräusch, as we say in German, perhaps a little bit more precisely. So after that, he went to Buffalo and studied with Morton Feldman. I think that's the most astonishing point, because Morton Feldman is not known for being amplified, he's not known for doing improvisation, but for sure he's known for listening, and for really making music by listening. It's also this approach. But I think there were also some struggles going on. He, as a soprano saxophone player, did a piece for soprano saxophone and electronics, and then he did a piece for an ensemble there. I think it was the finishing work called Attica Brothers, there for the studies, and it was a piece for ensemble and conga player. And the concert was about to start, and the conga player had a part where he just should come in a certain moment by a sign of the composer. And it was like here, there was a conga player, there was no music stand. So Feldman came in and said, "Where's the music stand? He needs a music stand." And then he went out, he brought the music stand, he put it there. And he said, "No, it doesn't need it. But he had to play with music stand. It was this kind of social distinction. That was the time. So they played the piece, and Feldman told him later, as a critique of this piece, music should be listened to in a red plush armchair. And your music, you have to listen to this, you have to sit on the floor. To sit on the floor. And that's also what I want to finish with, because I'm very happy that musicians like composers, I want to underline composers like Elliott, make it now to the American Academy, and we listen to this music on armchairs. Please enjoy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Reinhold, and thank you all for joining me. Thanks to the American Academy for hosting me here, and Inga Marinato, the fellowship, all the fellows and their spouses, the incredible staff here who operate way above and beyond the call of duty to make all of our work, if I may use the word loosely, enjoyable. The Academy provides an incredible balance between relaxation and productivity. So I think we're all appreciative of that. Here's my cue. I did have a certain amount of preparation, and I am glad. I had thought about maybe that we should move all the chairs out, but no. What I'm going to do tonight is give a little overview of the elements that went into the music that I make today. And what I'm going to touch upon is the fact that a lot of my obsessions as a child remain as an adult, or as much of an adult as a composer can be. And they have found their way through various digressions out and back, and in what I like to think of as a feedback loop. In fact, I like to think of almost all creative work as involving feedback. It's a way that systems amplify themselves and bring forth artifacts that then lead to further creative digressions that then lead back to the core points. And what I will be talking about in this is my various compositional approaches, which include very centrally the notion of translation from the inner ear to sonic manifestation, whatever form it may be, whether it's writing for other musicians to play, creating a graphic score or even a visual work, or for myself to play on an instrument. And at the core of this is the notion of psychoacoustic chemical change. As a composer, when I'm working on music, as I'm hearing the things that I'm manifesting, as they go from inside to outside, they, again, in this feedback loop, affect how I feel and how I think and how I hear. And this then further affects the next level of iteration of the music. It has to affect me both as a composer and also, ideally, the listener. The listener is a very important part of this feedback loop. One makes music as an abstraction, for whatever purposes, but ultimately it reaches its final manifestation when it's in relation to people who hear it. And what I'll go over in the course of this are how I work with transformations of densities, textures, acoustic phenomena, transformation of visual elements to sonic elements, and in reverse. And I'll talk a little bit about my most recent obsession, which is opera, and a little bit about the project that I'm working on here, Substance, an opera about the work of Baruch Spinoza. And I'll also touch on graphic notation, self-organizing system and algorithmic approaches, strategies for fully notated compositions, things that I might write for a string quartet or an orchestra, and finally, improvisation. And this will be the demonstration part of the lecture demonstration. As Christine mentioned, I have my 8-string guitar bass, which was built for me by Saul Cole, and I'll make a little noise on that at the end. And then if anyone wants, we can do some Q&A. So as a child, I was obsessed with science fiction, really, and from that, mathematics and physics, and thought I would pursue the life of a scientist. That summer of 1968, when I had a fellowship from, it was the Ford Future Scientists of America, I went to Carnegie Mellon. I was assisting scientists and finding my own sonic obsessions, working in the radio station, very much involved in the anti-war movement, and realizing how much time, at least the scientists I was meeting at Carnegie Mellon, were spent trying to get money from the Defense Department, to further their work. And I said, I can't be part of this. And as I was trying to manifest the theoretical into the concrete, this took the form more and more of working with sound and electric guitar. I'd played clarinet, classical piano for years, and it just somehow didn't have the kind of temporal resonance that electric guitar did, especially in 1968. So as I pursued that, I began to get interested in improvisation and jazz and began to teach myself the language of that. I'd long been involved in blues, important influence for me, starting out with listening to the rock and roll of the Yardbirds and the Rolling Stones, and from there getting turned on to Muddy Waters and Howlin' Wolf and country blues of Robert Johnson and Charlie Patton, and just finding my way from there in that summer of 1968 to non-Western music, to Stockhausen, to Xenakis and Varese, to mathematical theories of how one might organize music. It was really, kind of a complete reprogramming of my brain, which was a very important thing to do at that time, especially if one was going to be a creative musician. This led me to studies in jazz with Roswell Rudd at Bard College, and also in non-Western music. Roswell was an ethnomusicologist at the time, working with Alan Lomax and with Charles Kyle, who was also an important ethnomusicologist. And as I began to work more and more with musicians improvising, I began to reach certain limitations in that it wasn't so much about individual expression, although that was very important, especially music coming out of the free jazz realm of Ornette Coleman and John Coltrane's later experiments, Cecil Taylor. But I wanted to find some way to create a network that the musicians could feed back in each other in real time, and not just everybody individually, simultaneously express themselves. So part of what this led me to was to the notion, this is not the wrong, let's see if we can get onto there. Oh. This 2 clicks too many, and I don't think I can go back. The first thing that went so quickly was a graphic score from 1972, basically a temporal map of densities and textures to give the musicians some way to relate to each other outside of just their personal expression. As I was living on the Hudson River and immersing myself in the ecology of the Hudson and of chaos theory, bird flocking, notions of swarming, this led me to the notion of trying to map some of the phenomena that I experienced there on the Hudson to musical phenomena. So I would take a picture that I found of bird flocking and superimpose it on musical notation, say, let's try this as a paradigm for improvising together. And this was a piece from 1974, one of a series of compositions that I did on the Hudson River that were designed to map phenomena such as bird flocking, or river branching, fireflies, the notion of everybody playing at the same time but never playing simultaneously with someone else as a way of generating rhythms. Just various non-musical approaches to generate music together, somewhere balancing between improvisation and a music that was composed of instruction sets. And this is where I first began to take in the notion of algorithms and the idea that music could be not necessarily about black dots on a piece of paper that give someone instructions, exact instructions in time, but something that gives someone a map of activities to pursue in relation to the other musicians that are simultaneously pursuing a similar goal. And it's a feedback loop, again, between the mental act of going through these maps and the sonic act of playing music and taking in what the other people are doing and feeding back then to the process of moving on to the next step in the process. Now, I hope that doesn't sound too incoherent, because that's the beauty of feedback loops, and we can explore that further if we want. So from these Hudson River compositions, I began to develop a set of pieces to work with musicians. This brought me to Buffalo in 1974, where I did study with Feldman and also with Lajar and Hiller, pioneer of computer music, pioneer of algorithmic composition, and scientists, first and foremost, who looked to each composition as a set of instructions rather than here's music that's ordered in time. He would order music in time. Sometimes you have to do that to get things to work the way you want them to. But Hiller also was very much about saying, how does the operating system of this piece of music work? What are you trying to create with this piece of music? What identity does it have in its own form that you can then further by developing operations that are consistent with the definition of this piece? This was very important for me because I felt that it was a validation of things that I wanted to do, having to do with mapping natural forms and processes to acts of music. Studying with Feldman was a very different experience. Feldman was an incredibly brilliant thinker about not just music, but about visual art, about poetry, about philosophy. And to work with Feldman was to hear him expound on these various things. And sometimes he would actually be concerned about your music, sometimes in a very positive way, sometimes in a very negative way. One of my other favorite experiences with Feldman, I think one of my first really sit-down experiences with him was when he told me that improvisation, I don't buy it. And that was it, he dismissed me. And so, with Feldman, to be able to argue with him or to discuss with him why I felt that I wanted to make music in the way that I did, and here was someone who I greatly respected and yet differed in very many ways. So I had to find some resources to discuss this in a way that was coherent, both for him and for myself. After my experience in Buffalo, I'd kind of given up on writing music for other people, and I was more concerned with improvising, which to me was the most direct form of expression from what I was doing internally, what I was hearing in my inner ear, to what I could express on an instrument, and also to work in social situations, working with other improvising musicians to create structure spontaneously, especially with musicians who had this notion of a discipline where you weren't just expressing yourself in the most self-indulgent way, but operating in a spontaneous sense of structure. Another important milestone was the discovery for me of fractal geometry. In 1985, Benoit Mandelbrot's book, Fractal Geometry of Nature, was published. There were previous editions, and there were some writings in Scientific American about that. But this idea of a mapping of the mathematics of chaos and seemingly chaotic functions to very precise ordering, and to reducing them to simple instruction sets that could be applied to many other things was very appealing to me. Because, again, going back to this idea of working with natural forms and processes, especially seemingly chaotic ones, the flow of a river, bird flocking, Cellular Automata, which was a computer game that came out around the same time when people first began to have personal computers. There was a game called Artificial Life that used a very simple set of instructions to create very complex patterning that would develop until you formed a feedback loop called a strange attractor. Again, this applied very closely to musical phenomenon that I experienced working with musicians. This led to compositions such as Syndicate, which you were hearing when you assembled in the room. It was playing in the background. And the pieces that I wrote for Reinhold Friedel's ensemble for Zeitkreuzer's Syndicate was developed both for my own group, Orchestra Carbon, and for Zeitkreutzer, pieces like Coriolis Effect, that tried to find a balancing point between order and chaos, seemingly chaotic functions that would then coalesce into rhythmic unisons or into rhythms that interlocked with each other that would then move out of phase into, again, chaotic functions and then find strange attractors. Again. I'm going to skip now to opera. These were three excerpts from the opera Port Bou that the Academy presented on the 25th of April at the Concert House. And this was composed, well, really over the course of 25 years, but it was really finally coalesced into a piece last year. It premiered in New York at the Issue Project Room last October, and features singer Nicholas Isherwood, the pianist Jenny Lynn, the accordionist William Schimmel, the projections from Janine Higgins, and electroacoustic backings that I did in the studio. And it's about the suicide of Walter Benjamin at Port Bou in 1940 as he was escaping the Nazis. And I wanted to create a very compact work that telescoped just the last minute or two in his life into a 1 hour piece that brought everything out into microscopic detail, stretched things out so that you could imagine the internal state or to hear into the internal state. It's a through-composed work, although the singer, Nicholas Isherwood, is sometimes, in fact, the section that you saw, the excerpt of it, is allowed to interpret the written material because he has the great talent of a spontaneous improviser. Given written material and sonic backgrounds, he can then find ramifications of it in real time that he might not if he was only reading. In fact, the background that he was singing against was his own voice. I wrote a melody for him, which he sang over Skype, actually. We did it from his studio in Rome while I was in New York. And then I took that melody and time stretched it and moved it up 3 octaves to turn him into a soprano and convolved his own voice with that of a soprano voice so that he could then become his, you could say, his female counterpart and singing in duet with himself. In other sections, he's singing texts that were written to expound upon various things that I found in the writings of Benjamin. I'm not using Benjamin's own writings at all, but only my own interpretations of them. And sometimes the musicians are playing elements that are very much referring to the music of that era, music of Schoenberg and Berg and Webern, to me as the music of that time that best captured the feeling of what was going on in Europe between World War I and the beginning of World War II, this tightly wound chaos, that yet was very, very ordered. It wound up so tightly in its order that it could do nothing but to explode. So that was Port Bou. The opera I'm working on now about Spinoza is going to be very much concerned with his philosophy, and I'm not going to present it as any kind of historical background, although being here in Berlin and with the inspiring company of my fellows, I've begun to think about a lot of other aspects that might come into the opera. I imagine a discussion between Giordano Bruno and Gilles Deleuze, maybe interviewing Spinoza after his death and deciding whether he should be accepted into the Pantheon. Although I'm not sure that might be a little bit opera bouffaste, and so perhaps to be eliminated. But at this point, I can just play with the ideas. But a very important part of the opera about Spinoza will be his vocation as a lens maker. Spinoza made lenses that were used by Van Huygens, who discovered the rings of Saturn. I think Leeuwenhoek used his lenses. Van Huygens would not refer to Spinoza by name. He called him my little Jew, because of many of the prevailing attitudes at the time. Yet Spinoza's lenses were highly prized among those who worked with the microscopic and the telescopic. So this notion of lenses is going to be a very important part of the Spinoza opera, whether it's going to be done through video through audio lenses. As Reinhold was describing, this use of microsounds that are then amplified to reveal entire landscapes has always been a very important part of my work. And you'll hear that when I play guitar. Some of the sounds that one can make on a guitar that wouldn't necessarily be important at all if you heard them on a classical guitar or an acoustic steel string, but when amplified with electronics, take on a whole other significance. Harmonics, non-pitched sounds, noises, the artifacts of your fingers on the strings, then can take on a very great musical significance. Let me skip ahead one. This is a page from a graphic score called Foliage that was created between 2011 and 2012. Now, the page that went by way too quickly from 1972 was, as I said, an attempt to organize improvising musicians in a way that would give them an external coherence. One of my joys as a child was painting and drawing, and the idea of working in a medium not sonic, but yet having a sonic manifestation always appealed to me. And in 2006, I began working with graphic notation again. I had been working a lot with amplifying ensembles and processing them in the laptop. The limitation for me was that the sound always came from speakers. I felt that it was a distancing and that there was so much more complexity in the transience of an acoustic instrument that I wanted to find a way to get musicians, especially ones who are already involved in extended techniques, to somehow manifest the sounds that I was imagining in my ear and in the processes. So I began taking notation that I would generate in software like Sibelius, used for general, writing music for people to play, exporting it as graphic files and then bringing it into software such as Photoshop and GIMP, and then applying the same processes to the notation itself that I might do to the sound, using modulation of square waves and sine waves, time stretching, inverting, distorting, layering, using feedback. And you might be able to see in the upper left-hand corner is more recognizable musical notation. And it's being rotated around an axis and time stretched. And it generates a symbol set that musicians, especially younger musicians who are used to working with sound itself, who are familiar with the sonic processes when you take a sound and bring it into Pro Tools or some other audio editing software, you see what sound looks like. And they can much more easily manifest what I'm giving them as a visual input. So Foliage exists as a set of 80 pages that I published as an ebook and was also exhibited as a gallery exhibition of individual pages printed and hung on the wall, and then also a movie. And musicians are invited into the gallery exhibition could play it from the movie, they could play from individual pages, or they could walk around the room and improvise along with the score. This led to another score that was premiered in 2014 called Sylva Sylvarum. And I'll let this run a little bit because it was created to be a movie. It's 250 individual cells. You can see it starts out as very discrete musical notation. And then each cell is generated from the previous one using the processes that I described. It's also layered with some time-lapse photography of plant life and satellite imagery. It's an environmentalist screed, I might say. Some satellite photos of the evidence of climate change that is also layered. And this is used as a score for improvising musicians. And when I work with musicians with the score, I really don't like to tell them anything about what to play. They, of course, because of their familiarity with musical notation, they will interface with the very discrete musical elements that are presented, but then they'll also play off the processes that are engendered as the piece develops. This is a 30-minute version. It exists in a few different versions of different lengths. And every performance of it, with all the graphic scores, every performance is different, and every performance ideally retains the identity of the instruction sets that went into it. The piece Syndicate that you heard in the beginning is also developed in this same way. Syndicate is a construction set. I don't know if it's distracting. I'll just leave this play as I talk about Syndicate. Syndicate was based on cellular automata and on bird flocking and on the way RNA molecules reproduce. And it was 144 simple composed chords divided among 12 pages, and each musician has a page. And they can loop any one of their chords, or they can chain their chords to the looped chords of any of the other musicians that are playing. And they can also pop out and improvise. And the pop-outs can be imitated and then looped by the other musicians as a way of introducing mutation into the system. So again, you have music that sounds completely different every time it's performed. There's no right way to play it, no wrong way to play it, yet it has a very discrete identity that can be heard in every performance of it. Working with this construction set and with these processes, when I would be asked to compose pieces for orchestra or string quartet, I would try to apply these same principles. They began to evolve into a language, I'd say, that mediated between the sound I was hearing and an external language that could be then given for musicians to operate from. And this was used in string quartets from Tessellation Row in 1985 to pieces that were commissioned by the Radio Symphony Frankfurt, Racing Hearts, Calling, and on Corlier's Hook, that all were constructed using the instruction sets from the developed in Syndicate. And I'll play a little bit of On Corlier's Hook. Actually, let's go back to and this is for a symphony orchestra. This is a performance by the Radio Symphony of Frankfurt. I'll just put the score up so you can see it. It's absolutely conventionally notated. When you're working with a symphony orchestra, you know, they're not the kind of players that you can ask to interpret official score. I like to think of them in some of my worst moments as protein robots. You know, they have a black dot and they produce that sound, and they do that really well. And so if you want to have very specific sonic effects, you put the black dots exactly where they're supposed to be, and then you give them to the musicians, and ideally they will do what you ask. Find the section where we're at. You sometimes find resistance on the part of orchestral players. I was working on a piece with the Baruch Staatsopera, and the conductor told me that the cellist would only play it under protest, and that the brass players said his music was impossible to play. what you're going to hear in this section now is an example of these individual processes, independent rhythms and sonic textures coalescing into a strange attractor as the entire orchestra finds resonance. So that was an excerpt from One Corlear's Hook. That's going to be coming out this spring, a recording by the Unchecked Philharmonic from Ostrava, together with a string quartet, the Boreal, performed by Jack Quartet, a solo piano piece called Oligosino, performed by Jenny Lin, who you saw in the opera excerpt, and a string ensemble version of my group orchestra, Carbon, playing a piece called Proof of Erdos, which was dedicated to the mathematician Paul Erdos, who died a few years ago, and it was a commission from the VDR to not write a piece about him, but to write a piece for the Ensemble Resonance from Hamburg. And in the string pieces, I try to, again, apply a lot of these extended techniques and these mathematical transformations, but also the use of alternative bows, which I'll demonstrate on the guitar, but things like tube bows that I make from aluminum conduit, and I file aperiodic grooves in it so that when they're played across the strings, they produce non-rhythmic percussive attacks on the strings, or just springs. Anytime I find a clip lamp lying around, don't let me into your office, I take these springs, and they're, you find these type of springs of various lengths and densities, and they make wonderful bows on stringed instruments, whether guitars or traditional string instruments. Some string players are quite loath to let anything like this touch their valuable instruments, but I have to say, working with Jack Quartet, who are absolutely fearless string quartet, and they take these things and grind right into their instruments. For Jack Quartet, I also wrote a piece using bows made from ball chain. And because you can find ball chains of different length and density and weight, you can produce beautiful contrapuntal sounds. Let me see if I'll play a second of that, actually. This is the Jack String Quartet. And I'll stop that right there. That it's a longer work, 15 minutes, and move over to the guitar. John, could we turn the screen off? This is an instrument that was built for me by the luthier Saul Cole in Portland, Oregon, and he began working on it in 2003. He had the basic body design, notion of a headless ergonomic instrument, and I wanted to have something with a fanned fretboard, which allows you to have optimum scale length for the high strings and scale length and string tension between the high strings and the low strings, and also allows for a lot of alternate tuning systems without reducing playability. The small oval hull was a tribute to Django Reinhardt, a great influence and inspiration for me, as well as the so-called mustache bridge. And then Saul himself is a very creative luthier, and I look upon this instrument as much as being grown as it is being built. It's an incredible organic creation. I received the guitar in 2005, and it's been an important companion ever since. And I'll be using various alternate bows as well as my fingers.
Thank you very much, sehr geehrte Frau Wallach, lieber hochgeschätzter Elliott Sharp, meine sehr geehrten Damen und Herren. Ladies and gentlemen, please let me first express my sincerest thanks to the American Academy. It's a great pleasure and an honor to be here tonight to present Mr. Elliott Sharp with the annual award of the German Record Critics Award Association. A few words about this association. The jury I'm speaking for consists of more than 150 music critics, writers, musicologists and editors from German-speaking countries, Germany, Austria and Switzerland, organized in sections of 32 categories from symphonic and chamber music to rock, jazz, rock, gamelan music, pop, everything is there, from opera to folk and roots music. And of course, there are also cross-connections between the sections and special juries for border-crossing productions, being aware that today's music often exceeds traditional genres. The award enjoys a prestigious reputation because the main criteria are artistic significance and not the number of sold copies. So the award is completely independent from the commercial interest of the recording industry. The award is presented in different levels, Lifetime Achievement Awards, furthermore the so-called Bestenlisten, which means quarterly critics' choices, and annual awards, which are presented to a maximum number of 14 outstanding productions of the preceding year. Elliott Sharp's album 4 A.M. Always, released in 2014 by Yellowbird Enya Records, was selected for one of those annual prizes. 4 A.M. Always describes an atmosphere between night and morning, between hope and despair, something inexpressible with words, but with music. Together with his band Terraplane, Elliott Sharp is deeply rooted in rock and blues, transforming the primary energies of these expressions into an electric and eclectic context of personal-shaped contemporary music. I also will read you the German text from the certificate. Elliott Sharp siedelt seine neue Produktion 4 A.M. Always um 4 Uhr morgens an, zu einer Tageszeit, in der dunkle Gedanken durchs Gemüt und Linien kalten Schweißes über die Stirn ziehen. Der ganze verdammte Zustand der Welt, die kosmischen und irdischen Bedrohungen, Unglück, real oder eingebildet, die Liebe vergrübelt, typische Blues-Depressionen, auf denen aber Musik gut gedeiht. Beim frühen Folk Blues bedient sich Elliott Sharp nicht zum ersten Mal mit Sängerin, Bass, Schlagzeug und seinen eigenen mehr als 10 verschiedenen Gitarrentypen mit Playback-Überlagerungen, Gitarrenlicks von den Baumwollfeldern bis zu Jimi Hendrix mit düsteren Klangverfremdungen der eigenen Stimme und giftigen Dämpfen aus dem Elektronik-Kochtopf ist ein beispielloses und eben doch auch tröstliches Fanal für den Blues entstanden. As an instrumentalist and an improviser, Mr. Sharp is exploring new areas of artistic expression, crossing the borders between the ancient and the avant-garde, between tradition and innovation. He's playing one of the shapes of music to come today. As a conceptualist and composer, he proves to be a musician of visionary ideas. I'm pleased to present Mr. Elliott Sharp with the award and hand over the award of our association.
I would just like to say thank you to the association and to Bert especially, who I've known for a number of years, who hosted us for a concert in Leipzig in 1986. And I'm very pleased that we've been able to stay in touch and work together in these ways.
Great pleasure.
Thank you so much. Yeah, if anyone has any questions, I'm happy to entertain them and to obfuscate as much as possible. David.
It was a great presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.
You were talking at dinner and also in the talk, you mentioned that. Is it on? Is it on? Okay. You mentioned that in a lot of electronic music, all kinds of interesting sounds happen, but they all come out of speakers.
Yeah.
Something seemed like virtual, not quite real about that. Did you ever feel that way about the electric guitar, that it's coming out of an amplifier, the same thing?
No, the thing is, with the electric guitar, you feel the string vibrating, and even though it's coming from a speaker, there's a very tactile sense of a vibrating string. Also, especially, I mean, electric guitars can sound very nice when they're quiet, but I think electric guitars really come to life when they're loud. You know, when they begin to distort, when you're pushing speakers at the limits, the circuitry goes to the limit. When also, I mean, one might think of it as transforming from an Apollonian instrument. You know, in Plato's Republic, the string instruments were very Apollonian, very cool and rational, and the Dionysian instruments were the aulos, the double reed instruments which inspired passions and which were banned in Plato's Republic. And the electric guitar, when you make it loud, you play it through a fuzz box, it becomes a Dionysian instrument. I mean, certainly Jimi Hendrix, the various blues players that I idolized growing up, they all turned the guitar into a very vocal instrument. And so for me, it retains that quality. Anyone else?
I was somehow wondering, I mean, when you showed some of your scores, it looked always very simple. When I heard you play your guitar, I thought it must be almost impossible to notate that. And I'm wondering how you go about with this problem of notation.
Well, it depends on the music. Also, I mean, sometimes, when you're working with musicians who can play very complex scores and you have sounds that require it, then you, of course, make every note exactly as it's supposed to be played by the players. If I'm writing for a musician who's a very talented interpreter, I might not give them so much. I might give them general instructions, and I can say, in this area, maybe deal with this harmonic content, or deal with this rhythmic element as a core, and let them interpret, still operating within the shape of the music that's defined. Because, to interpret a score means to somehow stay within the intent of the composer. But again, if there's very specific things that have to be done, and if they require very complex notation, then of course you write every note out. When I'm notating for myself to play, I hate to have my face buried in a score when I'm playing. There's an old joke about how you get an electric guitar player to turn down, and you say you put a music in front of them, and I'm the living embodiment of that. I freeze up when I have music in front of me. So when I'm writing a score for myself, I'll give myself conceptual outlines. I'll give myself certain rhythmic motifs to jump off on, but I'm not going to give myself measure by measure instruction sets. But if I'm writing for a virtuosic string quartet, then I will absolutely give them things that they have to work hard to play, and will create sounds that can only be played by interpreting a very complexly written score. I think that
Thank you so much. You spoke earlier of your inner ear, and I was struck in your presentation by how you're able to express what's coming from the source, your inner ear, in different forms. So, of course, sonically, but also verbally and mathematically and visually. And I just wonder, have you come to find some kind of hierarchy and mediation from these different forms of expression or translation, sonic, verbal, visual, mathematic, in what's coming from your inner ear or your mind's eye to us or the universe?
Well, the most direct, of course, is picking up an instrument and playing, or when you practice an instrument enough, it becomes part of your entire physical and neural network, so you don't have to think so much about what you're doing. When you're verbalizing it, when you're writing a score, you're externalizing it to varying degrees. And of course, I think of it as being a bit of a hierarchy, that the solo instrumental activity is as close as it comes. I mean, if I could sing, I mean, I do quote unquote sing, but if I could really sing, then I would say that would be the most direct. But as it goes out to an instrument, then it is a little bit closer as it goes out to notated music, very exactly notated music, or if I'm writing in systems, because I do tend to think a lot systemically when I'm writing for ensembles, and that is a very it's not that far away from the original conception. You hear it and you imagine how it's going to be played by the instrumentalist. When you're making social music, improvised music with someone else that's not inside your own personal network, then you're creating something that exists outside of yourself. It's further outside. It's a conversation. I mean, like any conversation, unless you're, you know, a complete egomaniac, a conversation requires more than one person. You find someplace outside of yourself. When I've worked with musicians from non-Western cultures who don't necessarily improvise with the same language, at its best, we find something that operates in common, yet without using a common language. When I've worked with a Korean musician named Gamin or Bashir Attar from the master musicians of Jejuka, the playing is very spontaneous and pure. It feels like there's no discussion. You just play, and in any good improvisation, you create something spontaneously that exists outside of either of you. When I've played with musicians who don't have that quality, sometimes you have to approach them and operate in their territory more, which can be a great experience, but it isn't necessarily this outside of one's personal. And the further you go away from your inner core, the more mediated it gets. And I'd say the most mediated of that is when one gets commissioned to do hack work. If you're doing, you know, music for advertising or maybe a score for a film or a TV thing that you don't really care about, it can be very enjoyable. It can employ your resources of craft, but it has very little to do with your inner ear. It has to do more with your musical skills and your way of operating in a social way as opposed to in a purely musical way. If I think of the purely musical as that place that's operating inside the ear. Anyone else?
Hello, thank you. And I want to pick up on 2 points that you just mentioned in connection. One with the voice, and when with the piece in Port Bou, I noticed it felt like that there was elements of the singing that were a bit like throat singing, and I wanted, you just spoke about the inner ear, so I wanted to know what's your relationship to the voice and sort of the inner voice, because there are elements that were quite raw.
Well, you know, the voice to me is the most important instrument, and well, a lot of my ideas get worked out as sounds that I vocalize, although they might not end up that way in a performance. But even my guitar playing, I've always tried to find the vocal element in the guitar playing. The use of the slide and the ebow is a way of getting outside of Western intonation system. You know, the blues players I loved growing up all were able to translate their voice, using it as a counter voice to their singing voice by using a slide on the instrument. You heard Dun Bao music from Vietnam, the same. It's played on a slide on a monochord. I mean, there's so many musics from around the world that use this non-tempered way of approaching pitch. And then there's also the voice as something beyond just a way of creating melody, but of creating texture and of creating sounds that create an entire vibrating system. I was very much influenced by the Gyuto monks when I first heard them. Certain orders of Tibetan monks that do throat singing, do multiphonic throat singing, and Mongolian throat singing as well. It was used as a shamanic function where you're creating sounds in the octave below your singing voice and also with the harmonics, using your mouth and your sinus chambers to shape the upper partials to create counter melodies to. And I hear that sound and I've practiced doing that, and that's influenced also very much how I try to write for orchestra. I had a piece called Larynx
in 1987, where I tried to use my ensemble orchestra carbon as a giant throat singing ensemble, trying to get the entire ensemble to vibrate and to resonate and to generate harmonic structures that would echo the way a throat singer might get a resonant chamber to become excited and to amplify what they were doing. I hope that, yes.
Hi. I guess I'd start by saying that one of the biggest problems with graphic notation is obviously that a graphic symbol by itself doesn't mean the same thing for one person as it does to another. And you spoke about trying to get your ideas communicated to the musicians. And I'm wondering about, I believe it was foliage, the one where you had up in the top left corner was,
right.
And then it became very, very quickly, the musical symbols became very, very extremely abstracted and no longer really meant anything to a musician. Just a quick disclaimer, I have no issue with graphic notation at all. But I wonder in some of these circumstances if it wouldn't be best to simply sit down with the ensemble and work through with them, because as you yourself explained, when an improvising musician is faced with a score that they suddenly have to play, they have a different approach to the music. And from a different perspective, a classically trained musician who's never had any training in improvisation, which is still a problem today in the institutions, when they're told to improvise, they're always going to look for meaning in the notation that they see. And I think that the notation that you place in front of a classically trained musician is more of a border between them and improvised music than it is liberating today. This was possibly a different thing, when you were younger and during the 70s when there were a lot more, much more experiments going on and much more radical things, I think, happening in some ways. And I'm just wondering how you feel about that, because you've worked obviously with musicians where you've had, I suppose, directed improvisation as well as working with ensembles with notated music. And I'm concerned about the graphic notation. If you find that there's really something that a specific score generates a specific type of piece, or it's in some ways arbitrary.
Well, yeah, I mean, let me speak to that, because graphic notation has always been both a very strong plus and a very strong minus for me. At its most obvious, it's just a pretty picture, and someone plays what they want. And I mean, there's some, I think if you put any visual element between your eyes and your instrument, it's going to affect it. You're going to take that into your consideration as you develop an output. But what I tried to do with these pieces is to have very specific transformations of the elements so that the players can follow them as lines and say, okay, here I'm starting with a triplet rhythm, and now I'm taking this triplet rhythm, and maybe I'm rotating the phase of it, or rotating, or amplifying it, or subdividing it, or multiplying it, or having it degenerate into full granulation, maybe then coalesce into something that could be interpreted as a drone. And especially with musicians who have worked a lot with sonic editing program, I find a certain commonality in response. They know what a sine wave looks like, and they know what a sine wave sounds like. And so some of the pages, especially taking one page of foliage in isolation, because the pages are so linked, it doesn't necessarily give a clear picture of how the score works, but there might be a page which is a very specific, a sine wave, and then you'll see multiple sine waves. Then you'll see the sine waves modulated by square waves, then you'll see them rotated, then you'll see them stretched, and musicians can follow that process. And I find the younger musicians better than the older ones, because most of them do sound editing themselves in their laptops. Most of them have more than a passing familiarity with the physics of sound. It seems acoustics has become more and more a part of the conservatory education, as it should be, as it should have always been. So, I feel as a composer, you have a responsibility, if you're going to do a graphic score, to make it somehow matter enough that that graphic score means something to both the players and to the listener, that there's a relationship between the graphics and the output, which is also why I like to project the score as it's playing. So it's not just the players looking at it themselves, although it can be done. When players play foliage, it's completely up to them how they interpret it, whether they want to project it, where they just want to have the pages in front of them as any kind of notation. Thank you so much.